Armored Core is a pretty old series, and in fact it's existed more or less exactly as long as it's been technologically feasible to simulate giant robots fighting each other in an interactive 3D space. The appeal of designing your very own Gundam and taking it out into the field should be obvious enough, but the obsessive attention to detail, and the high degree of menu usage necessary to properly engage with it, has kept the series firmly contained within its niche. Still, it served that niche well for 2 decades, as a regular staple in FromSoft's industrial-grade output of mech-based B-games. And now, after a 10-year hiatus, it's back, to the bewildered fanfare of millions of From-heads who haven't heard of any of their games that don't end in Souls or Ring. To lay all my cards on the table early, I am one of those people who picked up Armored Core 6 as their introduction to the series solely because I'm an enjoyer of FromSoft's more recent games. Although I did play Chromehounds as a teenager back before Demon's Souls was even a glint in Miyazaki's eye. But before you switch this video off in disgust, you old-time purist, let me say that after finishing 6 and coming away largely indifferent, I did go back and play a few of the older games afterwards to see where the series was coming from, and in that respect, I think I've earned the kudos to talk about the series more broadly and where this newest installment fits into it, and where it doesn't. You may have caught me playing another card early just now, in revealing that my feelings towards AC6 aren't exactly overflowing with enthusiasm. True to the series it's descended from, it very much feels like a B game, despite what you may have heard from people on YouTube paid by FromSoft to tell you otherwise. And I mean, there's nothing wrong with being a B game, it's not a bad experience by any means, and there was enough meat on its bones for me to chew on contentedly for around 15 hours or so. But this is a game that, ironically, isn't going to set the world on fire for anyone but the most diehard of fans. As you might expect, this latest installment streamlines the old formula in many ways, presumably in the name of broadening the appeal, and some of those changes are genuine improvements. The adoption of a modern, standardized control scheme gives the player a lot more freedom and, well, control over their movements and abilities in a way that just wasn't possible 4 generations ago, and I find it hard to imagine anyone taking issue with that. Piloting your mech is more intuitive than it's ever been before, but that only accounts for half of the Armored Core recipe. The other half, designing, modifying and managing your mech in between missions, has also seen its share of streamlining, and it's here that I think FromSoft went a little too far and sanded off the rough edges that gave the older games a compelling texture in the first place. But I'll get to all that and more after giving you this spoiler warning, and your final chance to go and experience the game for yourself before watching. Although with this one, I'm hardly giving it a gushing recommendation. If you're a total mecha head, obsessed with big robots shooting guns and smacking each other, then Armored Core 6 might be just what you need in your life. And if that is you, and somehow you haven't already done so, then I'd highly recommend checking out the original to see just how similar the basic gameplay really is, and to see what a huge difference can be made by one small but very crucial tweak in the management mechanics. But if you're just looking for a good action game, or if you're only attracted by the FromSoft pedigree, then honestly my final verdict would be that you're free to skip this one and work on your backlog instead. Again, it's not a bad game at all, but if you ask me whether it's worth what I paid for it, my response would be something like, meh. And with that devastating reply ringing in your ears, let's get into why. We might as well start back at the beginning with the OG game that kicked the series off, to try and get a sense for the core appeal that caused the next few decades worth of sequels. As I've already hinted, it's very much a game of 2 halves. One based around action, as you directly pilot your mech in order to achieve your mission objectives, and a more menu-heavy one that takes place in between missions, as you manage your resources, swap out mech designs, and make long-term plans about which parts you want to buy later when you could afford it. While the missions where you pilot your mech in 3D space certainly make for more visually interesting footage, I'd argue that they're not necessarily where the player's most compelling mechanical interactions take place, and in fact, I would say they're quite simplistic. You enter each mission with a certain amount of ammo and health depending on the build choices you made, and these can't be replenished, so there is a certain incentive to play smartly and conserve them, but because almost every mission is only a few minutes long, it's usually not something you have to concern yourself with, at least in terms of the immediate gameplay repercussions. There's a fair amount of variety in how you can equip your mech, Legs can be biped, quadruped, or tank tread. Arms can support a variety of weapons from machine gun to energy rifle to laser blade, and there's a spot on each shoulder for a missile launcher or a support item like a radar. And I particularly like the way that last one gives you a choice to make to earn a feature that most modern games give away for free. To cut a long story short, there are plenty of choices to make about how your mech looks and plays, and you always need to be mindful of the weight limits that come with each body part, usually making trade-offs between speed, armor, and carrying capacity. As for the enemies, I should point out for those who haven't played any of these games that the vast majority of opponents you come up against in this series are not rival armoured cores like the one that you pilot. They're lesser machines that are generally destroyed with a few hits or a few seconds of sustained fire, depending on your weapon choices. So it's not exactly a fair fight, which is why most missions will see you going up against groups of them, one low draw distance room after another. In the few cases where you are pitted against another armoured core, it tends to be presented as a big deal, and sure enough, they are more of a threat than the average mook, taking and dealing a lot more damage. But the thing is, regardless of whether you're fighting an advanced mech that's supposed to be your equal, or just some poor sap driving a crane, your strategy will be more or less identical. That is, you'll strafe left and right to avoid enemy fire, and possibly do a little jump, space permitting, while you hold down the fire button until your target explodes. If it sounds basic, that's because it is, and you can rinse and repeat this method for almost any adversary in your path. That said, perhaps it's for the best that such a simple movement strategy predominates, because the controls are unfortunately a bit unintuitive and difficult to wrap your head around, especially for a modern player who's been spoiled by over a decade of the now standard twin-stick layout. In case you're wondering, it's tank controls on the D-pad, strafe on L1, R1, and L2 and R2 to look up and down, and that last one takes some getting used to, I can tell you that. And so this is why I'm thankful that the game doesn't ask for much in the way of complex movement when fighting enemies. A simple strafe, possibly augmented by a boost, is usually enough to mitigate damage, though without any kind of camera lock-on to speak of, you do still need to manually turn to keep the enemy in the center of the screen, and the turn speed can feel agonizingly slow when an enemy is close enough to cause you problems. Still, the simple nature of combat means that I didn't actually get frustrated with these controls until a mission with moving platforms 6 hours in, that would have been effortless in a game with modern controls, but was an aggravating and imprecise affair with the controls I had at my disposal. On most missions, your goal is simply to find and destroy all the enemies in the area, which is straightforward enough and doesn't leave you in any doubt about what you're supposed to be doing. Unfortunately, the game isn't always quite so clear about your objectives. Occasionally you have to do something a bit more complex, like destroying a fuel depot or defusing a bomb or planting explosives of your own and escaping. In those cases, it can be frustrating when you exit a mission area thinking you've completed all the objectives, only to find out you missed something and now you're not getting paid. This mission, which asked me to destroy some fuel supplies, took me a few reloads because I kept missing targets that were hidden in unexpected places. You just know that in a more recent game, these would be highlighted so that there was no chance of missing them. And Gundam knows I'm no fan of the patronising hand-holding endemic to modern games, but there is a middle ground between that and the opaque black box that is this mission. Now, so far I haven't been particularly complimentary towards Armored Core's simplistic mecha gameplay, but you weren't hallucinating when you heard me call the game compelling earlier. And what's compelling about it is what happens in between the missions, which means you're going to be looking at footage of menus for the next few minutes. Enjoy. Before even getting into any gameplay, the first thing that immediately struck me was the darkly satirical tone. As a mech pilot in a mercenary outfit working for the highest bidder, you're quickly left in no doubt that all morals should be left at the door. The very first choice you make in the game is picking between two starting missions. One that asks you to massacre some striking workers, and another that asks you to eliminate some squatters. Even 30 years later, this still feels like quite a fresh twist on the usual good guys bad guys setup that most stories fall into. In Armored Core, if your actions end up affecting the world in any way, then it's purely incidental to the profit you were trying to make. And the management layer of the game does a pretty good job of making you single-minded about profit as well, because for the first couple of hours you'll find yourself constantly strapped for cash and unable to buy any new parts to upgrade your mech. Most missions don't actually pay that much, and once you subtract the cost of replenishing your ammo and repairing your mech after the fact, you'll often find yourself with barely anything left over for yourself. While it's true that this drastically lowers the player's ability to purchase and experiment with new weapons and builds, it does lead to much higher stakes, and it also means that it feels more exciting when you finally get enough money for a part you've been eyeing up. On top of that, and this is really key so remember it, there are a limited number of missions in the game, and you can't replay older ones to grind currency. Every result is final, and if you fail a mission, the game usually just continues on to the next one anyway, asking you to accept the loss and make do with whatever you can. Even if you're save scumming and reloading to make sure every mission is a success, it's impossible to avoid a certain amount of losses, and as I said, there's a limited number of missions, so you'll always feel that pressure at your back to make the most of every penny, no matter what. There simply isn't enough money to buy every part, so the choices you make about what to prioritize are genuinely meaningful and have a lasting impact on your playthrough. All of this is to say that it's the management side of the game that really gives the player a much greater sense of living the mercenary lifestyle, buying coveted upgrades when a big windfall comes in, and always being on the lookout for an easy contract that pays well. This mechanical incentive can sometimes lead to great moments where you, the player, fall for a well-laid trap. For instance, I was eager to take one lucrative contract that looked like easy money, but it turned out to be an ambush, and I ended up with nothing to show for it besides the losses I took. And so, while the moment-to-moment action gameplay might be quite simplistic, the long-term considerations of managing your finances and making plans between missions are compelling in a way that elevate that simple experience to another level. When every shot fired and every point of damage taken will cost you something later, they take on another meaning and carry a lot more mechanical weight than they would otherwise. The losses and penalties you take on missions will affect what you can afford when modifying and upgrading your mech, and those modifications will affect the options available to you on your next mission, which will affect the losses you take, which will affect the mods you can get, and so on and so on and so on, in a continuous fractal of satisfying and compelling mechanical complexity. I want to repeat once more, because it really is crucial, this system works and is very effective at pulling the player in because of the limited nature of it all. You can't replay missions, so you can't grind for currency, so you have to use your limited resources to prioritize and make trade-offs that are genuinely meaningful. If resources were infinite and you could purchase any part you wanted just by grinding low-level missions over and over again, then the captivating metagame that makes the whole thing work would disappear instantly. I wonder if you can guess why I'm making such a big deal out of this. Anyway, let's move on to Armored Core 6, which I'm sure doesn't mess with this formula at all. So we finally arrived at the game you clicked on this video to hear me talk about, and now that we're here, I find that I've already covered a lot of the basics in talking about its predecessor. Maybe that shouldn't be a surprise, they are in the same series after all, but I do find something remarkable about just how similar the moment-to-moment gameplay is between these games that are removed by almost 3 decades. I suppose it goes to show that sometimes there's no need to reinvent the wheel, and just as in the original, the bulk of the gameplay in Armored Core 6 will see you sliding, strafing and boosting to avoid enemy attacks, while holding the fire button and watching the enemy health bar tick down. Now that's not to say there aren't differences, because there are plenty, mostly in the direction of giving the player more intuitive controls and adding a small bit of depth to the action segments. The finicky button layout of old is a thing of the past, and now it's effortless to manifest your intentions into movements on the screen. The standardized twin-stick control scheme that makes this possible, and the ability to lock the camera to an enemy, are obvious improvements that probably didn't take much brainstorming to come up with. But downstream of those changes are some other new ideas that end up giving the player a lot more freedom and options. Now that the shoulder buttons are relieved from camera and movement duties, they're freed up for more interesting uses. Now, each shoulder button corresponds to a different weapon on your mech, the 2 in your hands and the 2 on your back, not unlike a certain other series that sees you equipping each hand of your character. What this means is that you now have the option of firing multiple weapons at once, which wasn't possible before, and it's hard to overstate how much this expands the player's freedom and how much more fluid it makes things. Many weapons also have multiple potential uses, or different fire modes depending on whether you tap or hold the button. For instance, missiles can target multiple enemies if you hold the button, many rifles have an alternate fire mode, grenades and rockets can cause AoE damage, and most melee weapons can be charged up for additional power. All of this further increases the player's options and can lead to quite a complicated digital ballet on the top end of your controller if you make use of all 4 weapons at once, which you might as well if you want to maximize damage. On the defensive side of things, the game leans even further into giving the player options with the addition of a quick boost ability, or what is essentially a dodge button. With the greater agility of mechs in this game, the player is expected to use evasive maneuvers in a way they weren't really pushed to do before. Some enemy ACs can be just as nimble as you, and learning to dodge homing missiles at the last second is an essential skill that will quickly get you wrecked if you neglect it. Just as before, however, the vast majority of enemies you'll come up against are not your equal. They're less advanced machines that can be destroyed without much difficulty, and while I initially found this a bit underwhelming, I came to quite like it as a feature that serves to constantly remind you of just how powerful the giant robot you're piloting is. Finally, the last new feature I want to mention is the stagger mechanic, which comes straight out of Sekiro, but with a little more wiggle room and freedom attached to it. Staggering an opponent doesn't lead immediately to a killing blow like in Sekiro. Instead, it interrupts and freezes them for a short time, and gives you a brief window where they take extra damage from your attacks, and you're free to exploit these facts in whichever way you choose to do so. While my strategy evolved over my playthrough as I gained a better understanding of how to play, my ultimate one was to chew through the enemy stagger bar with 3 rapid-fire cannons going off at once, then charge in with the overwhelming force of a pulverizing melee attack. If I timed it just right, I could wipe out more than half of a boss's health bar in a single move like this. Altogether, these changes make the action-oriented gameplay of Armored Core 6 more engaging than in previous entries, and it's plain to see just how much FromSoft has learned from the last decade of making action games. One result of this is that Armored Core 6 is perhaps more accessible to the average player than the series has ever been, and whether you think this is a good or bad thing, the millions of copies sold must certainly be encouraging for the developer. I played it a year too late for this video to have any chance of being topical, but back when the game released I can remember seeing plenty of posts and discourse about it, a lot of it complaining about this or that boss being too hard. So when I finally picked it up on sale, I was fully prepared to strap on my big boy hat and buckle up for a difficult experience. Imagine my surprise then when it turned out that the game is actually quite easy. I'd read online beforehand that this boss, Balteus, was considered a difficulty spike and a roadblock for many players, but I smacked him up good on the second try. Either I fluked out and accidentally did an amazing job of speccing my mech, or most of the people who picked up this game were casuals attracted by the success of Elden Ring and were left floundering in a game that didn't give them the ability to summon allies. My guess is the latter. I wish there was a way to say all this without sounding like I'm trying to gloat or show off my elite gaming skills, but I truly am confused about why people found this game difficult. Even before I discovered my dominant strategy of the 3-gun barrage, I was having a relatively easy time just spraying and praying with missiles while darting around and making liberal use of the boost button. I won most arena battles, one-on-one fights against another character's mech, on my first try, usually in under a minute. Part of me wonders if maybe this is the point, and the real game is in designing a mech that can beat each opponent. But then, why was I able to beat everything with exactly the same very basic and very obvious strategy? The first boss I encountered that took me more than a couple of tries was Cataphract, I think because it's only vulnerable to damage from one direction, which neutralized my winning tactic up to that point of dropping a few hundred missiles onto my opponent's head. Once I factored that into my strategy, it wasn't so difficult either, but at least it gave me a reason to reconsider my options and think more carefully, which is more than I can say for the majority of bosses and missions. Again, the fact that I could beat almost every arena battle with the exact same tactic shows just how samey most of the bosses in this game are. And while I'm here, can I just say that it kind of takes the wind out of a climactic boss fight when you've already beaten them once in the arena, possibly very easily. To give some brief praise where it's due, one of the highlights of AC6 is the boss fight against the Ice Worm, which sees the gameplay, story and characters, as shallow as they are, come together in a satisfying crescendo that stands apart from the usual run of unspectacular encounters. Since I'm already complaining about the lack of variety, let me add that for the most part it's rare that the environment of a level will make any difference to your choices in how to engage an enemy. I can look past the frequent reuse of mission areas because those missions are quite short anyway and usually drop you in a different starting location, and since I see this as a B game, I don't think it's worth complaining about a mostly innocuous cost-cutting measure. What I will complain about is that of the different areas that are in the game, almost all of them are wide open spaces that can be completely ignored and removed from the player's decision making. Funnily enough, this is almost the exact opposite of the problem that was present in the original game, which mostly took place in cramped corridors due to the low draw distance. There's very little difference between an arena battle that takes place in a giant empty virtual cube and a main mission that takes place in a giant empty fuel refinery, although there are a couple of exceptions, most notably in one early mission where the boss is the level. A few more like this would have been much appreciated. The only other example that comes to mind of the environment actually affecting my choices was the late game fight against Iguazu, where the room's low ceiling made my vertical missiles untenable, which forced me to respec and led to me discovering the 3-gun strategy that I used to dominate the remainder of the game. All griping aside, with everything I've said so far and having seen the footage of both games back to back, you've probably got a sense for how much more fluid the action gameplay is in this latest installment. While it remains a bit simplistic, it is without a doubt the area where the biggest improvements have been made, and it seems to me that it's where FromSoft focused most of their attention. But you may recall that there are two halves to an Armored Core game, and as I've been repeatedly hinting up to now, they properly fucked the other half of this one. Just as before, you earn money from missions, with subtractions for replenished ammo and repaired armor, but the penalties are a lot less harsh this time, meaning that every mission is guaranteed to bring a tidy profit. There's no way to fail a mission either, and if your mech is destroyed, then you just go back to a checkpoint and try again, instead of continuing with the loss under your belt. As you progress and complete missions, it's impossible not to accumulate more currency, and because of that, it means a lot less to the player. Compare that to the original game, where if you screwed up you could lose money even on a successful mission, and I think you'll see where I'm coming from. Perhaps these changes were made with the same kind of accessibility in mind that led the devs to improve the action gameplay. But in this case, instead of improving the management mechanics, they completely gutted them and hung them out to dry. And the smoking gun I haven't mentioned yet, the thing that completely demolishes any chance of a management metagame between missions, is the fact that you can select old missions from a list and replay them as many times as you like, and get paid again every time you do. This turns currency into a resource that can be infinitely farmed, and as I've said time and time again on this channel, this makes it a resource that's not really worth anything to the player, and your choices about what to do with it no longer have any long-term mechanical consequences. In the original game, you had to carefully choose which parts to invest in, keeping track of long-term considerations like which parts to save up for and what to buy right now. Because you knew you had limited funds and a strictly limited ability to get more, you knew that you would never be able to buy every part, so every decision was impactful and every part you managed to scrape together the cash for felt meaningful. In AC6, if you wanted to, you could replay the first mission over and over again to grind enough currency to buy every part before proceeding to the second one. Obviously that would be very boring and nobody in their right mind would do it, but maybe you can see the point I'm getting at. Because currency is infinitely available, it, and the things you can buy with it, become meaningless to the player, a product of grinding rather than of taking calculated risks or carefully managing finances. I still hate using this word, but the Ludo narrative that was present in the original game of living a mercenary life devoted only to profit crumbles completely in the newer one, and there are zero stakes to any choices you make. On some level, you cannot fail to notice that it doesn't really make sense that your pilot can travel back in time, complete old missions again, and somehow carry the money back to the present to throw on the infinite pile. It feels jarring and gamey because that's exactly what it is. I'm sure that to some people watching this seems like a small nitpick blown way out of proportion, but I really think that this kind of thing can make or break how immersive and impactful the player's decisions feel when playing a game. When I was a few hours deep into AC1 and I had long-term plans I was working towards, every missed shot and every avoidable chunk of damage felt like a real blow that would have lasting consequences to my playthrough, because every loss was one I would have to swallow and attempt to compensate for on subsequent missions. Whenever I made a mistake in AC6, I knew that in less than 5 minutes it wouldn't matter, because the mission would end and I'd walk off with a nice profit either way, with a chance to do it again if I wanted more. While the story of Armored Core 6 still sees you taking on the role of a mercenary of dubious morals, it falls flat when there's no mechanical consideration to prop it up. By far the greatest success of the older games in the series was in the way they used their management mechanics to put the player into that mercenary mindset, and the absence of those mechanics is the greatest failure of the series' return. From the outside, Armored Core 6 looks like it follows the same basic recipe as the rest of the series. Superficially, it still appears to be a game of two halves, one designing a mech and one piloting it, with plenty of welcome improvements to the piloting gameplay that lend it a far more accessible face. When you dig a little deeper, however, it's clear that FromSoft poured a lot more attention into the flashier and more action-packed side of the game, at the direct expense of its menu-based, resource-managing counterpart. Even before I went back to check out the older games, I spent much of my playthrough of this new one feeling like something was out of balance. Once I'd settled on a winning strategy that beat every opponent I came up against, I had no real reason to ever open the build menu again. And sadly, even in its new and improved form, the combat isn't really deep enough for it to carry the game alone. After getting to grips with the basics and finding that there wasn't a whole lot of complexity hidden beneath them, I spent most of the second half of my playthrough thinking, is this it? While increasingly hoping that each mission was the last one. Now, after going back to see some of the older games for myself, I think I can confidently say that this newest entry is missing the spark that made them compelling. The pivot to focus on refining the action was presumably intended to make up for the total erasure of the management side, but as I'm sure you can tell by now, my opinion is that the developers made the wrong call here. What I find most disappointing about this is that FromSoft had its big breakaway hit by giving audiences what they didn't know they wanted, an immersive experience that didn't patronize the player and trusted them to take the game and its world seriously. With their return to Armored Core, I'm sorry to say that they've taken a step down the opposite path, with most of the gameplay feeling disposable and free of consequences. Dark Souls wasn't engrossing because the action was deep or complex, because let's be honest, it really wasn't. It was engrossing because the consequences of those simple actions felt mechanically meaningful. When the stakes are higher and you can suffer real losses with a single mistake if you're not paying attention, the player gets pulled so much further in and gets so much more immersed in the game world. Whether that's a high fantasy landscape of demons and old kings, or a far future setting where the pilots of giant robots compete ruthlessly for a slice of corporate profits. With the management mechanics all but removed entirely, the stakes are gone from Armored Core 6, and there's nothing replacing them to really pull the player in and get them invested. What you're left with is a pretty average action game with a long list of 5-minute missions that don't feel meaningfully distinct from one another, and what was supposed to be a game of two halves instead just ends up being half a game.